Okay, let's start. My name is John Hassler from Stockholm University, and I would like to welcome you all to this opening panel of the Congress. It's a pity, of course, that we couldn't meet all in Copenhagen, a city I really love. But it is great and actually remarkable that we can meet virtually instead. So I think that's going to be a quite good substitute. In this panel, we're going to discuss climate policy. And I first like to note that there is an enormous scientific effort going into describing the mechanisms behind the relation between emissions of greenhouse gases and climate change. And recently, this effort was summarized in the first of the reports of this IPCC 6 assessment cycle. But one could say that this report doesn't really deal with the fundamental causes of climate change, namely the decisions of billions of people, firms, and politicians that lead to those emissions of greenhouse gases. And neither does it deal with how to solve the problem and how to steer all these decisions in the right directions. So how could we make market forces work in the right direction? This, however, is, of course, exactly the expertise of economists. And here with us today, we have three great economists to discuss these issues. We have Reguant from Northwestern University, who works on climate policy, and in particular issues relating to emissions from electricity generation. And recently, she was also a member of a group advising President Macron on climate issues. We have also Luis Garicano, professor at the IE Business School in Madrid. Luis is also a politician representing the party Ciudadanos in the European Parliament. And you have recently been involved in writing the European Parliament's proposal of border adjustment mechanisms to hinder carbon leakage, i.e. that tougher carbon policy, climate policy in the EU might become ineffective because emitting activities move abroad, and that needs to be dealt with. Finally, we have Hans-Werner Sinn, previous president of the Ifo Institute in Munich, and among Hans-Werner's many interests is climate policy. And you have also been a bit critical to EU's new idea of climate policies. And I noted that in particular, you say that the border adjustment idea, at least in the version of the Commission, is naive. So it's going to be great to hear you discuss these issues. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the word to Mar. Go ahead, Mar.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So I'll be presenting some overview, like very high-level picture, and then Luis will go into more details, as well as Hans-Werner. That I will talk a bit on my view on climate policy. I wanted to motivate a little bit why we need to take climate policy very seriously. I think in the last couple of years, everyone is kind of suddenly becoming more aware about the dramatic consequences that climate change is already having on our lives. For example, the floodings that we witnessed here, even though the impacts have already been there for a while, I think suddenly people are more aware of this. And I think we need to be aware that this is only going to continue to grow. And therefore we need to, at least in my opinion, do everything we can so that climate policy is taken more seriously. These are some examples of what climate change can do, and we're already seeing, like food and water insecurity. Just recently, the Colorado River, it was the first time in history that started serious rationing, instability and extreme events, either all the forest fires we have witnessed in the last 2 summers, the floodings that we witnessed, massive de-icing, like the ice is melting very fast. Even scientists who were concerned about climate change are even more concerned about climate change. So anyway, this is my introduction to say that we need to take the urgency of this problem very seriously. The presentation that I will give, it's a very high level, and it kind of conveys some of the ideas of the report that we prepared for President Macron with Christian Gollier and the Commission of Experts. But I have to say it's an edited version to reflect my opinions and my thoughts on this. So this is just a picture that many of you will know. It's actually not from the last IPCC, but it's basically showing what the declines of emissions should be. And I just put this picture here so that you see that in 2000, we were already saying that we should peak emissions and go down. Then in 2005, we said again that we should peak emissions and go down. And we keep saying that, but in all honesty, the only thing that we could doing is growing our emissions. So nowadays, all the paths that lead to somewhat meaningful mitigation of climate impacts say that we need to go very fast, decrease our emissions. At this point, even though we have, as economists, written a lot about the value of waiting and thinking about carefully about the policies, at this point, it sounds like the value of waiting is kind of getting smaller and smaller because really the need of action seems to be quite high. So we need to work for the policies to be as good as possible, but understanding that as good as possible will not be great, to be honest. We have been familiar also, unfortunately, with exponential events and how exponential events work. I wanted to put this picture so that you can see particular concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere in the last two millennia. And and if you look at this picture and you're not concerned about this exponential growth in CO2 emissions, I guess I consider this problematic. It's important to keep in mind that climate change is different than other pollutants we're aware of. So some people might be familiar with pollution like SO2 or NOx. SO2 or NOx are not a stock pollutant, so they are emitted and then eventually they fall down. So we can think about it as a more kind of static problem. But the problem with the climate change is that it's a stock pollutant, and anything that we emit will stay in the atmosphere for like a long time. So that's important to consider because, as I was mentioning, the need of action is high, and any action that we take, even if it very dramatically reduces emissions, as long as we have emissions going up, climate change will continue. So the need for adaptation and transformation is really, really high. This I don't need to speak too much. I guess it's a room full of economists, but there are many challenges with climate policy in case it's not clear already from the failure of climate policy that I have showed you in the last two previous slides. There are free radical problems, what we call often leakage in the context of emissions policy. There's the political feasibility that has hindered many of the otherwise feasible progress. There's lack of agreement on the level of ambition. There's the problems of long-term credibility with a political system that kind of prizes the short-run gains. And there's honestly an overall lack of prioritization. There are many market failures that we could name: externalities and observable actions, innovation and coordination failures, timing consistency, and kind of discounting issues. So it's a huge problem. And I think, again, all of us in the room, I hope the 88 of you will leave this room and dedicate yourselves to the study of climate policy. So when we looked at this with the Commission, we wanted to acknowledge that this is a global problem, and Europe is a small part of it, to be honest, although it was kind of at the origin of it with the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So as of today, Europe is maybe 12 to 15% of emissions. It's important to think about that when designing the EU Green Deal. But I wanted to give a bit of a more positive message than maybe what will come later. I think the EU Green Deal can be a policy tool that can be effective, maybe not 100% effective, but if it's not clear, that's already ruled out from the picture. That said, this picture is also important to keep in mind that the same way that we are putting efforts on climate policy, for reducing our emissions, we need to equally spend resources and intellectual human capital to design policies for drastic adaptation to changing climate. If we deal with this as an extreme event, it will not go very well. I think it would be very advisable that governments start planning actively for what's going to happen instead of as a remediation strategy. So this is some simulations we ran for the report. They are almost silly, but that was kind of the point of the simulations. We were just pointing out that the net zero in Europe really doesn't mean much, taking into account that Europe is just a small area. And if we wanted to really agree, basically, if we wanted to have a path of emissions compatible with a 2-degree goal or 1.5-degree goal, that sometimes you hear from EU policy, we really would have to go to negative emissions very quickly. This means that not only the European Union should go to zero, but it should actually start being net carbon negative. So in this simulation, we simulated what is a consistent path consistent with a 2-degree warming. And what should Europe do if no one else does anything else than Paris? But assuming that people comply with Paris, this is the red line here. And you can see that Europe basically should be carbon zero by 2030 and then start being net carbon negative, so sequestering CO2 in net. This is obviously not feasible, but again, it's important to keep in mind as it really highlights the difficulty of the problem and the need for immediate action. So we had a battery of recommendations. I'm not gonna illustrate them all here. In the report, we spend a lot of time talking about carbon pricing and how to improve the current carbon pricing mechanism. Oops, sorry. Luis will talk a lot about this. In our report, we recommended basically to increase the scope of the EU ETS, which as of now exempts a huge chunk of fossil fuel emissions, to include the border tax adjustments in the line that are being discussed in the Commission, although Luis will go into the details. Also enhancing the transparent redistribution of the revenues, something that often has hindered the political support for these policies. And also that basically we highlighted that the tax in itself can be critical, not just to tax the externality, but also as a source of inducing innovation. And this is kind of important to highlight because sometimes people don't like the taxes because they increase prices and they don't lead to innovation, but actually the high prices, obviously, again, in a room of economists, high prices can help inducing innovation. Sometimes it's underappreciated in policy circles. We also explicitly mentioned the need for innovation policies that are specific and explicit. And this is in part to mitigate this global challenge that we need to go not only net zero, we need to go negative. I'll talk about this in the next slide. We also discussed the role of bans and standards. I think as economists, we tend to not like bans and standards because they are very normative and they kind of make choices, but they are actually much more popular and they are perceived as more equitable, particularly in a context of growing income inequality. So some people have the feeling that no matter how high the price, there's always the 1% that will be able to keep burning, and that's typically not very popular. So people are more and more happy with things like hard bans on short flights. Or for example, I also think one should ban the public funding of fossil fuel infrastructure, and all of these things are very normative, but are more popular than taxes and get some jobs done. We also highlighted in the report that we need to keep an eye on leaks from carbon pricing itself, for example, via the carbon adjustment mechanisms, but also more broadly, even in the report, we only touched on it briefly, in agricultural policy. So the agricultural policy in the EU is very naive in the sense that it wants to make the EU look green and organic and local, but it has huge implications for deforestation elsewhere in the world. And I think it's often misleading in EU policy. I also want to highlight that maybe I don't hear as much about this. I think it's important to keep an eye on leaks in terms of foreign aid policies. So it would be quite unfortunate that we make a huge effort to go net zero and we basically bring all foreign investment of fossil fuels in developing countries with the excuse that it's foreign aid. I think foreign aid in developing countries is great, but it should come in the form of renewable energy and renewable policies. Finally, we highlighted the importance of intermediate targets. again, they are very normative and they do seem inefficient in many ways, but I think it's the only way to kind of keep the system a little bit accountable and also kind of give some prizes, in the sense that if you keep within the target, that seems to work well, at least with part of the constituents. And again, it seems a bit silly to have these targets, but on the other hand, it's what seems to get traction in policy circles. The last one, it's a bit my opinion, but I do believe very firmly that it's better to have some imperfect action than no action at all. That seems to be quite the norm in many places. So I think we are far past the moment in which we can design a perfect carbon policy. So on the R&D policy, I wanted to give some more detail. So in the report, we emphasize the ways in which R&D policy can contribute with this global problem. It's really not credible to expect or wait for all countries to contribute. So the question is, okay, how can EU policy have a big of an impact? And naturally, innovation is one that seems very important. I think it would be crucial to launch international prizes, like COVID-like prizes with high stakes for negative emissions technologies that we already need and will need much more of them. There are some technologies already that are on development, and the cost per ton of carbon is not crazy given the damages that we are seeing. But it's very unclear that we can scale them to capture the tons and tons and tons and tons of CO2 that come into the air. So it's really important to put kind of all the many eggs in that one basket. Finally, I think when it comes to R&D, it should be a bit prospective in the sense of emphasizing R&D that's incentive compatible. And to me, R&D that's incentive compatible, it's R&D for technologies that make fossil fuels economically irrelevant. It's great if fossil fuel companies invest in carbon capture sequestration. We will need all of it and more, but I don't think that's where the public funds should put their emphasis. They should put their emphasis on technologies that make fossil fuels more expensive than the alternative. This might sound a bit dreamy, but actually in many ways we are not far from it in some sectors. And one example is the electricity sector, where renewable and batteries are close to being cost effective. And in many countries they already are. So if we could put more money to make that really a no-brainer, it would avoid a lot of investment in fossil fuels by countries that otherwise will have no ability or no incentive to consider the climate change implications of their actions. So that's our recommendation for where the public funds will go, although again, it would be great if there's a private investment in carbon capture sequestration. Finally, I wanted to just do a brief note on why the EU is a natural leader in climate policy, and I think we need to embrace it as much as possible, because honestly, I don't think it can come from many other places. Given that I'm based in the US, I wanted to make the US a comparison, which is quite depressing. So in the US, the median voter, it's quite unclear that wants to do anything about climate change. In the US also, emissions per capita are much, much larger than in Europe. So it's kind of very hard to pass policy that really doesn't even start to get at the problem. I think the EU is also specially positioned because we are not very well endowed with fossil fuels. Certainly there are EU companies that have a good share of oil extraction and production, but if we think about the territory, there's really not that much oil. And even in terms of GDP, it's only 2 to 3% of GDP compared to 7 or 8% in the US. So I think putting too many baskets on cooperation with the US, too many eggs on cooperation with the US might be misguided, because the US really is not very well suited to do much about the problem. I think another way for Europe is to see this as an opportunity, because to the extent that we come up with these technologies, that many of them are almost there, of kind of pushing fossil fuels out of our supply curve, it will also enable the EU to basically expand this action to other countries and help, for example, countries in Africa to completely circumvent a lot of the fossil fuel investments and directly invest in cleaner technologies. It will be hard, and I'm not saying it's easy for the EU, but it's easier than for the US. So that's kind of my final slide. And again, these are very high level notes, but I hope that we can get into more detail in a second.
Okay, thank you very much, Mar. So I'll give the word immediately to Luis.
Thank you. You can hear me well, John?
Yes.
And you can see my screen, I hope. All right, thanks very much. I think that I don't need to convince you that the international dimension of the problem is the key aspect of this. And to me, the graph that Mar showed is the perfect graph. The European Union, Europe can reach so far. And one of the key tools that we have to try to make this into a international effort is to try to get everybody on board is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I'm going to tell you what the efforts that Europe are doing amount to and what are the prospects of success. First, on why do we need a CBAM? I told you the graph Mar showed is probably the perfect one. In spite of all these 30 years we're doing multilateral efforts, the greenhouse gas emission has continued at a 2.2% annual rate, at 41% over the last 30 years. Europe has been leading on this, as Mar wants us to. We've been the first ones to have these climate and energy packages, and we've agreed to the net zero by 2050, the climate neutrality by 2050. There is really kind of significant progress. And most of the progress in Europe is based on something that is very dear to economists. Indeed, that was proposed by economists in the US, that in the US it wasn't implemented, but that it was actually implemented in other contexts, and particularly Europe. The idea is that the European Union emission trading scheme basically allows you to run a cap and trade system. So the EU ETS works on the principle that you get a limited number of allowances. Those allowances are, in principle, they're distributed, some of them are distributed for free, they could be auctioned. Then you actually trade on them, and then the company, the installation that has surplus emissions is going to trade them to the next one. And then you're going to be reducing the total allowances, the amount of gigatons of CO2, until you get to the desired net zero. Of course, that leads to an increase in carbon prices, which is desirable, even though it's politically a problem, as we've seen in some countries in Europe. However, carbon leakage takes place. The problem is that you have an ETS in Europe that works well, but what happens is that companies can move the installations outside of the European Union. Then what you get is this, since the introduction of the ETS, Europe drops the emissions, but the rest of the world actually, the imports of CO2 from the rest of the world go up, because what happens is you just move a plant out to Morocco or to wherever you want, and you export back into the European Union without worrying about the ETS. The way to block that would be a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where the EU plant and the non-EU plant both face the same cost, either an ETS cost or the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is equivalent. So what you need is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that ensures that the price of imports reflects the carbon content. So it allows you to avoid jobs being shipped out, but also CO2 being shipped out. That's the basic idea. Ultimately, what you want, and Hans-Werner is going to talk about that, is you really want the climate club. Nordhaus talked about this extensively in his Nobel Prize speech. Basically, what you want is to tell people, look, if you're not following up on these efforts that Europe and others are doing, then you're going to have to pay a price. You're better off inside the club than outside. Obviously, this sounds really bad in China and in Japan and other places where people worry that we're trying to impose our rules on them, but the truth of the matter is this is good for the entire world. How do we do this? I have 6 minutes to tell you briefly about the design principles here. So the first thing is the European Parliament approved a proposal that said, look, we need to do it for green purposes and to address carbon leakage, not for other purposes. I mean, here the key issue that I want to flag to you that is going to be the crucial political issue is not just the World Trade Organization rules, but the perception by the rest of the world. Are you trying to do climate policy, or are you going to try to put through the back door a protectionist Europe, that a protectionist barrier that helps you? So the first thing is the carbon border adjustment mechanism must be force people outside to pay the same price that producers would pay, and should allow producers who are already paying outside to discount this from what they're paying when they export to the European Union, and it should allow them to take into account to prove that they're actually more efficient than they are. The EU proposal, which was issued on the 14th of July of 2021, just a month ago, agrees with these objectives. So there we are happy the Parliament and the Commission are kind of on the same page. The second key issue is the policy instrument. Are we going to use an excise duty? Are you going to have customs duties? Or are you going to have something based on the EU ETS? Parliament very strongly says, look, we need to go to mirror the ETS. That facilitates WTO's compatibility, that allows for the price adjustment, that allows for easier politics as well. And happily, the Commission legislative proposal agrees. So 2 out of 2 good news from the Commission. Now, when you get to the scope is where we get in trouble. So as an economist, I don't need, as economists, all of you who are in the audience, I don't need to explain you that it is necessary that you avoid distortion, substitution between input and in the value chain, in the different stages of the value chain, and between different products horizontally. If you only cover some goods, then you're going to have, obviously, a lot of arbitrage opportunity. Obviously, this is hard, because if you try to cover a lot, then you get politics which are harder, and implementation, initiative implementation, which are harder. So it is okay to start with a few areas. The Commission basically starts with only a few areas. It says the legislative proposal that you'll be hearing about for the next year, that Europe is now going to be discussing, only covers cement, steel, iron, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity. And it's going to have high risk of distortion. Just think of one, for example, cement. You can, instead of use cement, you can use steel and iron, which, okay, they are covered by the proposal, but you can also use glass or ceramics, which are not. So you will have this substitution, and you would hope that this was a first step and that it would lead to a broader proposal with broad coverage. This was in the plans of the Commission for a long time, but it hasn't been actually in the last proposal. There is no automatic extension to a broader scope. So we'll see. Now, a very key issue is the assessment. How are you going to measure it? You guys all will be thinking, whatever proposals on the table is going to have a huge administrative burden. There was the Economic and Social Council of the European Union made a proposal that I thought was very reasonable, which was you weigh the basic materials in the goods and you multiply by carbon intensity of the product. That way you include everything vertically and everything horizontally in a simple way. We can go into depth on that if you want later. So if you have a car, you measure the components like you do with your tomato juice in your fridge that has a label with other components. You multiply by the indirect equivalent emissions of tons of CO2, and then you get the total price by multiplying by the ETS price, the EU ETS price. Now, the Commission didn't go that way. It went to a proposal that already in the leaked proposal was a gigantic administrative burden on importers who have to register in advance, hire verifiers, send reports, provide guarantees. It's a nightmare. But the 14th of July proposal is even worse. I mean, it basically proposes, sorry for the typo, one authority in each member state, so importers will face 27 times the administrative burden, which is going to be translated into a price of goods, into protectionist concerns, etc. As to the articulation with the existing EU ETS, the key issue here, and this is the last point I'm going to make, which is important, are the free allowances. Everything that matters in the politics right now are the free allowances. The free allowances, this is the following idea. You allocate people the equivalent allowances to the 10% best producers. So if the 10% best producers are here, then all of these allowances are allocated to all of these installations for free. What you notice with this curve, it's kind of a supply curve, is that most people are pretty close to the efficient frontier. So by giving the equivalent of 10% of free allowances, you're actually covering 90% of all CO2s for free. So people actually pollute in the ETS, in the currency ETS, basically for free, mostly. That's what the free allowance is. Now, what happens is the Parliament says, although it said it in committee and then it was problematic in plenary, but I'm not going to go into that. The plenary amended. There was a huge amount of lobbying in favor of the free allowances. So Parliament says, look, the free allowances need to go. And there needs to be a system that whether it's exporting, let me just show you here, basically in the domestic market, you are eliminating free allowances. In the export market, you are eliminating free allowances, but in order to not disadvantage exports from the European Union, you can give some export rebate. But the important thing is on the domestic market, there is a level playing field without free allowances. That's not what the Commission proposal says. Realistically, we don't think anything will happen until 2030. And the risk here is that if the CBAM has all this big system of free allowances, then it's not really going to come into force. I'm basically out of time, but I want to just briefly tell you politically what's the big deal. The big deal is you have to prove to the Chinese and Japanese, the Americans and the Russians, etc., you're being really about the environment and you're complying with the GATT. That requires non-discrimination between importing and domestic goods, the Article 3.2 of the GATT. That means I'm not treating you as an importer worse than I would treat myself. And you're also not treating different countries in different ways, the most favored nation. If you cannot prove these two things, which I think the system that I outlined at the start, maybe not the one the Commission outlined on the 13th of July, does fulfill. I think it does as well. But anyway, if you don't fulfill this, you can still do something else, which is you can use an argument, which is Article 20 of the GATT, which allows you to make an exception to protect exhaustible natural resources. So you can say, look, I'm WTO compatible, even though I don't do this non-discrimination most favored nation clause, because I am actually about the environment. The Commission wants to go this path. I think the other path is different, it's better. Because, I mean, here's the political problem. The US, as Mark told you, does not have an ETS. The US doesn't have a carbon emission trading scheme, doesn't have carbon pricing. So the moment you put the CBAM, you're going to hit the US, if you extend it, in all of their exports with tariffs, or what they perceive as tariffs. They're going to say, no, we are doing other things. We're putting regulations. How do you make this politically feasible? Well, you can have some way to make the regulations into some sort of prices implicitly, but you can imagine the econometrics of that, which would be a nightmare. So that's the political issue. They don't have carbon pricing. We do have carbon pricing. CBAM is based on carbon pricing. How are we going to kind of politically deal with all our partners worldwide? And that's, I think, why the Commission is going to be 6 goods, which, by the way, the US doesn't export to Europe. So that might be the way that the 6 goods were chosen. Thank you, John. Sorry, I went to mute.
Thank you, Luis. Hans-Werner.
Yes. Let's see, where are we? So it doesn't go on.
It's coming up. You just go down and make the presentation there. We can see your slides, but it's not in presentation mode yet.
Yeah, but it doesn't move into presentation mode either. Why doesn't it do that?
The presentation is probably a different screen in the laptop, Hans-Werner, I think. So you can share the screen again.
It should go, so you can't open it in presentation mode there, or?
No. You see a little bit, no? But not very much.
Is it Bildschirmspräsentation, or I don't know German.
Yeah. Do you see this?
Yes.
Well, then I do it without the presentation mode. It should be fine. Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks a lot. This was interesting, what I heard from Mar and Luis, and give me, though, a slightly more critical view of what's going on in Europe. I think we do a lot of unilateralism, and as long as we can't be sure that the others follow, it's difficult whether that is a possibility. We have the first problem. I talk a lot about a number of problems, is that the Paris Agreement was only signed by a small minority of the 191 signatories. Depending on how you calculate it, it's between 30 and at best 70 who committed to anything reasonable which you could count. No? So it's most countries did not agree to anything binding for them. And look at what happened at the Nepal's G20 meetings in July, Russia, China, and India refrained once again from accepting binding CO2 constraints. And that is important because China is currently emitting more CO2 than all OECD countries together. They just overtook the OECD. And also the Americans play a somewhat ambiguous game here. There's lip service in favor of common agreement, but the Biden administration has asked recently OPEC to increase its oil production. How come? You know, either you're in favor of reducing CO2 emissions, or you want to increase them in order to have cheap energy. We have a major problem with compliance to some general agreement in the Paris Accord. The second problem is, I think we do a lot of damage by violating the law of one price. We are economists, we all know that all carbon polluters should bear the same price in order to have the same marginal abatement costs, which would be efficient from various perspectives. You know that. But we don't do that. Europe has a trading system covering electricity, plus a little bit of chemicals, and plus shipping in the future, but not more. The rest is directives and constraints, hard constraints, without any economic meaning of and control. And new ideas suggest that there should be 3 emissions trading systems. Franz Timmermans recently proposed that, one for electricity, one for vehicles, and one for buildings, with completely different prices. But as a matter of fact, in order to make cars more efficient in terms of CO2 reduction, it costs 10 times as much as it would cost to insulate our homes better. So it's an enormous inefficiency here. And I'm afraid we might damage the automobile industry. Look at the EU regulation. This is what the various steps in these directives here implied. We did have a diesel equivalent of 5 liters per 100 kilometers until 2015. Then in 21, we had 3.5. In 2030, the EU regulation of 2018 says 2.2. And now the New Deal, the Green Deal, says we will have only 1.8 liters per 100 kilometers. This is impossible to construct a car like that. You can only do that by including electric vehicles. If you have 2/3 electric and 1/3 combustion, then you might get it. But you know, that's a joke. Electric engines also in Europe emit a lot of CO2 because the energy mix is far from what we would like to have it. There's lots of coal. In Germany, for example, there was a recent study by Joanneum Research, an Austrian firm working for the German and Austrian Automobile Club. They found out that an electric vehicle would have to go 219,000 kilometers in order to become more CO2 efficient than a modern diesel engine. You know, because they have this heavy CO2 rucksack coming off in terms of the battery coming from China. The third problem is we have a market for fuels, a world market for fuels, not so much for lignite, that is rarely traded, but for hard coal, for gas, natural gas, and for oil. And we get lots of direct leakage here. This is not the leakage through the product embedded CO2 or carbon content. It's a direct leakage through the markets. And I think that has found very, very little attention, even though it's so trivial if you think about it. You know, what happens if Europe reduces its emissions by combustion engines? in strict proportionality, it consumes less crude oil. And this oil is available at the world market. And at lower prices, it will be consumed by other countries, the non-abiding countries in this world. You know, some people say Europe is small, has only 8% of CO2 output of the world, and so it doesn't matter what we do. That's not the problem. Even if we are small, we have to do something. But the point here is that our effort to reduce CO2 output is resulting in zero CO2 reduction in the whole world, because the petrol, the fuels are being sold to other countries, which at lower prices are happy to buy them and burn them. So this is a sort of unilateralism which is entirely useless. Of course, you could argue at lower prices, there will be less extraction. Perhaps the oil producers react like normal firms that produce ordinary goods, but this is not the case. You know, as the oil is already there, you just have to take it from the ground, and taking it away, the extraction and exploration costs are negligible relative to the user costs of oil, which reflect the future possibilities of using and selling the oil. It's a pure scarcity price, completely disjunct from the extraction cost. And it is hardly possible to reduce the world market price of oil to a level that it's no longer worth taking it out. Here you see some empirical information confirming what I just said. This graph shows the oil price since 1990 and shows the aggregate global oil extraction since 1990. Both harmonized that their mean is equal to 100. And what you see is the oil price goes up and down. For example, you have this peak before the Lehman crisis 2008, when there was an enormous boom. You should, under normal circumstances, expect that an increasing world market price increases the extraction, the supply of oil. But what happens? Nothing. You see nothing in this curve. It's completely flat. Or after that, in the Lehman crisis, when the world market price went down, then the producers should stop producing. Do they do that? No, they don't. Why should they? They simply don't. And we have no reaction. There's only one reaction, which we do see on the right-hand part of this graph, and that's the COVID crisis. What differentiates the COVID crisis from these other price variations? The difference is now the whole world is affected. Previous price changes resulted from idiosyncratic demand changes in some parts of the world, which led to exactly this effect which I described at lower prices or high fuel was directed, shipped to other parts of the world. Gas pipelines were directed elsewhere, and the stuff was consumed there. But now, in the COVID crisis, everyone had a problem, and the entire world demand declined. And here you see that the first time we do see a reaction, you know, and this reaction we need. If there is not such a reaction, it's completely useless what we are doing in Europe. So European unilateral reductions in demand just drive down the price, but would not drive down extraction. It would have no effect on CO2 in the world. And the question is it worth endangering the automobile industry, for example, in the view of such a picture? I think it is not. And I think we are blindly moving here in LA, which will lead us nowhere. Before the Americans, before the Chinese and the Indians participate, this won't work. The climate club of one, which we are forming, is not enough. That's the problem. And the corollary is that the carbon border adjustment is only of limited use. I'm not against it. You know, in my book on which I wrote 10 years ago, I advocated a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm not against it. And I wouldn't say it's naive or stupid, but it's not enough, because it covers only this tiny little bit of carbon, which is embedded in the imported goods and forgets about the main import of the direct carbon bearers, namely natural gas and crude oil. And even if we would enlarge its scope, that these imported direct carbon stocks would also be taxed, then we would have exactly the phenomenon that I described before, that China and other countries would consume the carbon which we set free. And then there's, of course, the fourth problem, which I've called the green paradox, which now often is called rush and burn. That is all the sable rattling which we are doing in the world, that we will have a green, brave world in the future where we don't need the carbon anymore, leads to anticipating reactions of the suppliers. I have an interesting quote here from Guyana. Guyana recently found huge amounts of oil in the ground. And here on 15th of August, Vikram Bharat said, despite climate change, our government will not let the chance for welfare and success unused. Which industrial nation will do that? The demand for oil will not last forever, perhaps another 20 years, perhaps 30 years. Then oil may be out of fashion. We have to make sure that we extract enough from our resource in such a short period of time. It's only fair that we can develop our country, given that other countries of this world have done that as well. Our people have the right to enjoy a better life. You know, that's a major problem, which tells us that unilateral partial actions will backfire and will give us a few decades of excessive carbon extraction rather than a development in the right direction. Or think about Norway, given another example. Why has Norway built up its sovereign wealth fund from oil revenues instead of preserving the oil in the ground? Why were they so stupid and sell everything in the market? They were not stupid. They knew that the green world would come where they would not be able to sell their oil. So they extracted it before and now have everything in terms of financial wealth, and their citizens can be happy. Or why has Germany been mining so much lignite? Look at the statistics. On the left-hand side, you find the stock of lignite, which various countries possess. At the top, the United States and so on. Germany is a minor country. It has a little bit of lignite, but not very much. And then on the right-hand side, you see the annual flow of extraction. Where is Germany? Germany is number 2 in the world in terms of lignite extraction per year. How come? One reason is the Greens. The green movement comes from Germany. It's stronger here than anywhere else in the world, and it came earlier. So it made everyone clear in the energy business that you have to hurry up to get the stuff out of the ground, sell it, rush before the Greens take over power and forbid you doing this. And this is a major problem in the world. So my last slide, what can we do? We have to do something, that's for sure. Mar was very convincing. What she said was perfectly right. From the technical side, I think there's no way but to do it without nuclear power. That's the CO2-free production of energy. We have to do that. Then sequestration and afforestation to reduce carbon in the air. We can buy the Amazonas. It's not that expensive. I did the calculation. At today's prices, it would be cheap. We could have a worldwide withholding tax on financial investments to make sure that the oil sheikhs have little intention to change their wealth from underground into something above the ground, Swiss bank accounts, for example, because we would tax the returns there. If the whole world moved from a destination-based income tax to withholding tax, a source-based tax, then we would get them. We would make it less attractive to bring the wealth from the ground to above the ground, and therefore we would slow down climate change. And then, of course, we need the global emissions trading system. That's clear. Everyone wants that. The question is how we get there. And Luis has given us good hints how we can do it. But it's clear the climate club must be big and have a credible threat point. If we do it as a tiny little club, the Europeans, that's by no means working. The others will laugh at us, and they will just speed up. China will speed up and erect even more coal plants than they are already doing. And we will get a long period, a substantial period of increased CO2 emissions. So I have a big interrogation mark at the end. I don't know better than Luis what this climate club could potentially establish. But I think in the moment, cannot be optimistic that we get the thing under control.
Okay, thank you, Hans-Werner. We are running very short on time, but I would like to have some very short interaction during the 8 minutes we have left. But please be very short in your intervention. So Luis, are you focusing on the wrong leakage problem, and a problem that doesn't really matter compared to the ones that Hans-Werner are talking about? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, and maybe Hans stop the sharing screen. I think Hans made a lot of points. I mean, I think I agree with what Mar said initially, which is that, for example, something like people rushing. This is going to happen with whatever scheme we have, unless we just announce something by surprise. So these are kind of good observations that I cannot criticize, but that we have to take as they are. This is going to happen, and similarly, as you said, the Norway problem. I loved Hans-Werner's point on the Norway problem. The fact that I thought there was this Guyana quote, which was so insightful, right? People just taking out the oil and then saying, yeah, we're not consuming anything, but we're just taking it out anyway. So yes, there is that leakage, and I don't have a super good solution short of the climate club, which is worldwide. The problem with these climate goals is that we know how hard the problem is, and we know that, as Hans-Werner said in his last slide, the solutions come short. And I agree with all those other solutions. Nuclear is a solution, expanding ETS is a solution, having the same ETS for everything is a solution. But many of his arguments are almost inevitable, and we're going to come short anyway. We need to do what we can, as Marcel.
Yeah, I also think that so I agree with the leakage problem, but I think, first of all, it's a bit of an extreme picture of 100% leakage in the global oil supply. And I do think it's extreme leakage, but I think, let's be honest, if Europe has some impact, it will not be 100% leakage. But secondly, I think you're underestimating the role that prices have in innovation. So if we hit the automobile makers, they will become better and they will innovate to make electric cars more efficient and to kind of produce cars or alternative transportation modes. I think we keep obsessing on people have cars of electrics or people have cars of fossil fuels. Well, why not transformation a bit more dramatically? We need to make progress on those ends. So why not Europe, where there is political consensus and we want to devote resources to innovate in these areas? At some point, electric cars are a no-brainer for many places that don't give a shit about climate, because electric cars are much cleaner. So the local pollution impacts of oil cars is high. And in places like Beijing or Shanghai, they have plenty of policies that are trying to roll out electric vehicles, not necessarily because they care about the climate, but because they care about the many other harmful impacts of oil. We do not have to minimize the many other harmful impacts of oil. So even if it's only for our own benefit, taking into account some of the byproducts for climate, I think it's already a good idea to, for example, stop motorcycles from burning oil, stop many gadgets from burning oil. So it is even at this point, the technology is far enough that it can be unilaterally interesting for Europe to push these technologies, even if the climate impacts are relatively modest. In California, in extreme conditions, electric vehicles are becoming a battery to make some homes function as a microgrid and offer protection for many of the extreme events that we will be seeing in the future. So I think we do not have to minimize the even unilateral benefits that we can get in Europe from this transformation, even if the climate change benefits are relatively minimal. And I think these unilateral benefits will be larger if we are aware of what's coming and we prepare many of these innovations in a resilient way. Like what I was saying about thinking about the transport system that can offer resilience in bad extreme events, or thinking about how to build buildings with a small carbon footprint, but also that can resist in whatever cheap way we can extreme weather conditions that are coming. So I think there are many more unilateral benefits that we recognize from these policies.
Thank you, Mar.
One thing on the leakage, John, if
Luis,
I can just add to what Mar said, to raise to Hans. I mean, there is the view that it's all in queue, and that whatever we don't do decreases quantities. There is the view that you expressed that nothing is in queue, and we think that some of it will be price and some of it will be quantity. I mean, as Mar said, it's not complete leakage, although you're right that the impact might be much more than we fear.
But Luis,
let me just
Hans-Werner, okay, come in.
Yeah. Well, the argument was that the leakage will not be 100%. How do we know? It could easily be above 100%. So if you combine the green paradox with the leakage story, it can be above 100% because you announce a path towards very radical green measures. So you reduce today's price of carbon fuel in the world, and you announce to reduce it even more in the future. Then you will get an overreaction of the suppliers. They will extract even more today than they otherwise would have done. And the non-abiding countries have a double advantage. First of all, they get the fuel which the Europeans set free and don't use anymore through the carbon market. And second, they get the extra extraction of the oil producers, which they do because they are afraid of more measures to come in the future. So this is only a theoretical possibility, I agree, but we can easily have more than 100% leakage.
So, but can I push you a little bit on this? Let's suppose it's 110% leakage. Are you suggesting we do not need to do anything about pricing externalities from carbon? I think we should still keep pricing these externalities and get any marginal innovation that we can, even if it's locally, even if leakage is 100%, we should still put the right price. So you're saying the law of one price doesn't hold, but you are focusing on the law of the wrong price. So I'm not sure the law of the wrong price is better than the law of different prices, where at least some of those prices are correct. Like the law of the wrong price is very misleading. I just think that at some point you need to get people to innovate, and it's pretty easily to restrict the entry of cars that do not satisfy EU standards. So will you hit the automobile industry? Yes, maybe in part, but they can keep producing cars that will sell, at least in the European Union, and probably will be very attractive to other areas. As far
this
as
is a second order argument. Yeah. You know, the first argument is to reduce CO2. And now you say,
yes, but innovation will reduce CO2. You are thinking of a very marginal, simplistic view of, you know, if we don't all tax carbon, we shouldn't tax anything. But having a tax on carbon will improve outcomes, will make cars more efficient, will make buildings more efficient. More efficient buildings, they burn less oil. So even if you continue to use natural gas, but you come up with ideas that make buildings more efficient, why shouldn't a country not want more efficient buildings?
I'm going to let Hans-Werner come with a very short final comment, because we are actually out of time. So
you have a strange view of efficiency. If there is no CO2 effect, it is more efficient to reduce our carbon consumption. This is something which I simply can't follow. My definition of efficiency is different.
Okay, I'm very sorry that we have to end, because this was a fun discussion, and I think we could have come a little bit further, but unfortunately we have only 1 hour. So I thank you very much, Louise, Mar, and Hans-Werner, and I hope we soon get to speak more about these things. So thanks all, and thanks for the listeners.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Was war das? Was aber etwas sehr herablassend.